Okay, let's have our beginning here. I will do my ritual introduction and say, for the umpteenth time, for most of you already know me here, I'm Mabel Berenson, and I'm the director of the Institute for European Studies, which is also a sub-institute within the Einaudi Center, which is our center at Cornell for Global Studies. It's a real pleasure to introduce and to have today with us Jonathan Laurence. Jonathan Laurence is actually a Cornell undergraduate. I'm looking here, he studied European politics and he graduated summa cum laude in Phi Beta Kappa. So a great Cornell success story. He's also a PhD from Harvard in government and a professor of political science at Boston College, where he directs the Klaus Center, which is a center for the study of constitutional democracy. So welcome. I just want to say a few things about him. He's unique in many ways in European studies, is that his work has basically, most of his early work is mainly on France, and he's actually spent a lot of time focusing on the role of Muslims in Europe and the role of integration in Europe. His first book was Integrating Islam, Political and Religious Challenges in Contemporary France. And his second book is The Emancipation of Europe's Muslims, the State's Role in Minority Integration. He's coming here today. I mean, he's the editor of numerous volumes. He has written voluminously both for the academic press and the public press. He's had numerous fellowships and studies in Europe. And he's I think I'd be a permanent member of the Council for Foreign Relations. I may be wrong about that, but no, I wasn't wrong. Anyway, he's coming to speak to us today about his book, Coping with Defeat, Sunni Islam, Roman Catholicism, and the Modern State. And this is a comparison that in many ways it seems almost, well, yes, of course, given the religious populations of Europe, and yet I haven't really, this is one of the first times I've seen an extended comparison of this. So welcome to Professor Laurence.
Thank you very much, Mabel. This is, it's very exciting to be here. This is the very room where I gave my first talk ever about the Italian elections of April 1996, which was something that Sid Taro got me to organize with some other professors here. So, so it's very nice to be here, and thanks for the introduction, and thank you guys for being here. So when it comes to the public image of Islam in international news, the 2020s have not felt very different than the 1990s. In the 2020s, we've had the US raid on an Al-Qaeda leader. There was an attempted murder of Salman Rushdie, the triumph of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And events over the past generation, the war on terror, the disappointing Arab Spring, have generally exacerbated long-standing fears about the capacity of Islam to adapt to the modern world. On the other hand, even in modern democratic Muslim nations operating under secular law, religion remains largely under state control. So is there something about the Islamic religion, as scholar Bernard Lewis asked after 9/11, that, quote, the Islamic world seemingly failed to modernize or keep pace with the West? So some point to the essential unity of religion and politics in Islam to explain this, to the alliances between rulers and Islamic scholars, the ulama, or they point to the lack of a quote unquote Protestant Reformation in Islam. And this is contrasted normally with Christianity, which some say was destined for separation. And the contention of the book that I wrote here is that none of these arguments is quite right, because a century ago, the same things that are being said now about Islam were then considered to be universal truths about the Roman Catholic Church. For example, that it resisted the authority of the modern state, that it resisted pluralism and liberalism. And in the US, many saw Catholic immigrants as a threat to state-church separation, especially when it came to public education and family law. And this was unusually problematic after the Italian kingdom's capture of the Papal States and Rome in the mid-19th century. Because for 60 years after that, the Pope actually fought to restore his old political power. Meanwhile, anarchist attacks in Catholic countries and by Catholic immigrants in the United States tended to link political violence and terrorism in the public imagination with a Roman Catholic background. And so, although scholars have stressed their differences, I'm going to make the argument that there are many similarities between the historical and political trajectories of Catholicism and Islam, and argue that it is illuminating to compare them. So to start with the basics, they expanded in the same area, a few centuries apart, and they were not merely religions, but also political empires. So they organized transnational hierarchical networks, and each spiritual leader, the Pope, the Caliph, governed administratively over millions of subjects. And both of these religions have long struggled with the modern state, which has deprived them of political power and challenged their organizational autonomy. So one question is, how did they lose so much power and yet salvage such an important role in providing spiritual guidance to nearly half of the world's population? Well, I argue that it is helpful to think of this process in terms of three defeats. Each defeat cut off religious authorities from believers who were stranded under another rule of law. So the first defeat is the end of political religious empire, and here I compare the Protestant Reformation with the unraveling of the Ottoman Empire. The second defeat came at the hands of the modern nation state, which the Catholic and Muslim worlds experienced 1 century apart. And the third defeat is the era of unexpected mass migration, when millions of Catholics came to the United States and millions of Muslims migrated to Western Europe after the Second World War. Now, each defeat, I argue, provoked an institutional response from Catholic and Islamic religious authorities, a religious counter-movement that emphasized the organization of prayer and ritual instead of political executive rule. And while this was done in a spirit of resistance to the modern state, it was also the first step towards surviving the encounter with the modern state. Because each phase brought with it the rapprochement of the principal religious authorities to coexist under the rule of law. And the process that had been underway within the Ottoman Empire was interrupted by decades of European occupation and by the Turkish Republic's abolition of the Caliphate in 1924. So the Vatican survived, but the Caliphate did not. And the consequences of these decisions are still being felt today. There is, of course, extreme fragmentation of the former Ummah, both along new national boundaries, but also along redefined sectarian lines. So another consequence is that Islam remains under state administration, although I argue that in the 21st century, there have been significant moves towards a rebalancing of the state-religion relationship. But the question of who speaks for global Islam, who defends Muslims worldwide, who defends the religion's holy sites, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, remains violently contested. And so we have widespread fitna, or fragmentation and dissidence. Now, looking back 150 years, we actually would have expected opposite outcomes for Catholicism and Islam. While the Pope was barricading himself in the Vatican and insulting Western democracies, the Sultan was courting them and asserting a place for Sunni Islam within the international state system. So what accounts for the apparent reversal and divergence? Well, I argue that much of what is seen as essential to these religions is actually the product of recent history linked to two contingent outcomes from the 1920s when they parted ways. The Pope maintained home rule and a sovereign parcel of land, facilitating his transformation from executive ruler to spiritual ruler, while Sunni Islam lost its caliph, who was ousted from Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem and exiled from Istanbul. So how and why did it come to this? Well, I proposed quickly revisiting the moment when each religion suffered its first modern defeat. So the Reformation marks the first defeat for the modern Catholic Church, when a set of reformed churches rose up, crossed Northern Europe, and took over essentially 1/3 of the population, what had been under Roman religious authority, and about 1/3 of the European landmass as well. Now, the Counter-Reformation was designed to stop those losses, to stem those losses, to staunch the flow. And this marked a turning point for the professionalization of a global church. During this period, dioceses were dramatically expanded. New seminaries and colleges were created to train priests and students. And a congregation for propaganda fide was established to oversee the religious life of Catholics outside of Catholic rule. So the church did not embrace defeat. It formally aimed for reconquest. Now for the Islamic counterpart. The Ottoman Empire underwent a comparable loss of territory and millions of believers to European rule in the 19th century, leading to nearly 2/3 of the world's Muslims who lived under French, British, and Dutch rule. Now, in their own terms, the colonial powers were attempting to return the caliphate to the Arabs, as they put it, after centuries of Ottoman influence and leadership. And so the Europeans cut off all seminaries, courts, and religious foundations from Istanbul, from India and the Dutch East Indies to the Middle East and North Africa, and they replaced the caliph in the religious lives of their new subjects with new nationally endorsed religious leadership. And they enforced this all the way down to the prayer for leaders in the Friday prayers. Now, as the Ottomans lost territory and came under increasing pressure, they took a page from the Counter-Reformation. Their defeat led to an expansion in global Islamic affairs. Istanbul professionalized its clerical establishment, a policy that we know as pan-Islam. The pan-Islamic policies pushed the Sultan Caliph, who was most active in this, Abdulhamid II, closer to spiritual status as a global prayer leader and away from a political executive role over believers. So the Caliph was the Islamic ruler with sovereignty, of course, over the religion's holiest sites in Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. And up until the very end, his was also the only major Muslim land not under European occupation. But Ottoman influence extended well beyond the territories that the empire ever contained. Ottoman outreach and Islam helped Muslims lead religiously observant lives by sponsoring a global network of mosques and seminaries and Sharia courts. And as with the papacy, even as the number of individual subjects declined, they commanded the hearts and minds of hundreds of millions of followers globally. The Turkish Republic abolished the longest modern caliphate in 1924. But in fact, those networks had already been fatally weakened by the European occupations. And so this is where I argue that the trajectories of the two religions really begin to diverge. So to bring this divergence into focus, I think we need to look at how each religion responded to what I call the second defeat, the rise of the nation state. So the first defeat was dealt by external actors, right? You had Protestant Reformation, you had kings of England, of Denmark and Sweden who were creating their own churches. With regard to the Europeans moving into the Ottoman Empire, obviously you had French and Italians and British and others. But the second defeat is inflicted internally on religious establishments by national governments who have new secular agendas. Now, for Catholicism, this took place through the civil constitution of the clergy, for example, in France, the Kulturkampf, of course, in Germany. And the church was brought under the control of newly created ministries of the interior, with appropriated church property and commandeered the nomination of priests and bishops and cardinals. And they ended church privileges, as well as the church's role in education, justice, and office holding. And the church responded. Sorry, this is the slide about what the 19th century states were doing to remove religious autonomy and take over here. And the response of the church, of course, was to issue the Syllabus of Errors, to convene the First Vatican Council. They also called up an army of foreign fighters, of Zouaves, to physically defend Rome from the Italian nationalist army. But of course, after 6 decades of political and military conflict, the Roman question was finally resolved by the Lateran Accords. So the Vatican city-state was an elegant reply to the question of papal sovereignty. The arrangement allows the Pope to exert temporal powers, although only over 1,000 or so subjects. But since then, the Church has managed to recover its internal autonomy nearly everywhere. And this is what I call soft restoration. It ultimately landed in a place where it was again running its own schools, running its own seminaries, and chartering its own civil society organizations, and of course, nominating its own personnel, including at the leadership level. And if you contrast that with the fragmented nature of Islam after the end of Caliphate, the leadership of Islam passed to the Islamic affairs ministries of individual nations, and echoing the anti-clericalism of Catholic statesmen in Europe, Muslim statesmen in Sunni countries also appropriated the religious properties of the religion. They pushed traditional hierarchies out of public life, out of their roles in education, in the justice system, or the policing of morality. But in this case, unlike with the Roman Catholic case, there was no independent spiritual authority who could effectively counteract or adapt to this process. Instead, you had the nascent nation states, such as Turkey, who were very inadequate custodians of the religion for the early decades after the Caliphate. In fact, it's not just that the new Turkish Republic took over the old ministry of Vakfs and religious foundations, they completely defunded it. So there are about 20 years when there's no activity, no religious activity that is being, that is allowed. And there's certainly no creation of trained professionals. The religious studies, Islamic studies completely died out for a couple of decades, and then over time has been gradually restored. But the overall impact of a kind of disinvestment in religion over time left citizens with minimal familiarity with their own religion and made them vulnerable to other claimants to Islamic authority and to competing political agendas, such as eventually the Saudi global promotion of their Wahhabi Islam, but that as well as, of course, is in interaction with the Iranian Revolution and the spread of Shia revolutionary ideology. Now, what I show in the book is how this interacts with the domestic religious establishments, the newly created ministries of Islamic affairs. And I try to show that as domestic threats grew, that the state religious apparatus grew with it. And here, this is just from the Turkish case, but there are charts also about the Maghreb, about Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. But you can see that the timing of the Diyanet's growth, the Diyanet being the religious affairs agency, that the agency increased its personnel, increased its spending in the wake of coup d'etat. So it was very much related to internal governance. And of course, this was happening in the context of other international challenges. But they found that the less they invested in religion, that the more their citizens were vulnerable to cross-border influences. So to consider the impact of what I call the third defeat now, which is the era of mass migration, which also coincided with periods of international terrorism in both cases. So while these religions were locked in combat with secular states at home, each also saw the unexpected growth of minority diaspora communities overseas. So this happened in the US and Europe about 100 years apart, when suddenly millions of Catholics, millions of Muslims were living for the first time beyond enemy lines, so to speak, where they lacked strong religious institutions and were susceptible to other influences. And in each case, alongside the massive labor migration, you also had thousands of political refugees and violent extremists who came from Europe to the United States in the anarchist milieu, and from North Africa and Turkey to Western Europe in the Islamist milieu. And they cultivated an audience within the labor migration. So in the United States, the church adapted by building more buildings, by creating more schools, creating more dioceses in order to cover the territory and prevent the infiltration of rival ideologies or the weakening of their ties between believers and religious institutions. But even when there were 10 million Catholics in the United States, so by around 1900, all of this activity still took place within the missionary congregation of Propaganda Fide. Okay, so US Catholicism, much like Islam in Europe, was entirely governed by the countries of origin. So the foreign interests of the homeland states, which literally still governed the parishes with German bishops in the German provinces, Polish bishops in the Polish, Irish bishops in the Irish populations. And so it was an entirely foreign-run religion up until the first decade of the 20th century. And so this is just one example. The apostolic delegate was always an Italian cardinal, not an English speaker, who was nonetheless the official representative of Catholics. And these are the numerous homeland Catholic associations set up for the Catholic diaspora in order to essentially keep those diasporas nationally oriented, very much like you see in Europe with regard to the countries that are majority Muslim. But there are two assassinations that change the course of Catholic history. The first is that of the Italian king, Umberto, in the summer of 1900 by a New Jersey anarchist born in Italy. And the following year, of course, United States President McKinley was assassinated by a second-generation Polish American. Now, these attacks were not religiously inspired, but authorities here and in Europe linked the radicalization of young Catholic men to the absence of any religious training or background or education. So what was the response? Well, the number of clerical visas for Catholic priests skyrocketed. And at this moment of crisis, the US president, Theodore Roosevelt, who succeeded McKinley, opted to engage with the American Cardinal, Gibbons, instead of with the apostolic delegate from the propaganda. This is a crucial moment in the Americanization of the Catholic Church in the United States. Rome ultimately recognizes more and more US seminaries to ordain US clergy, slowly ending the importation of priests. And they went from the collegio model, which essentially trained priests for service by bringing them back to Rome or to Belgium and then returning them to the migration community. But this is what changed once the United States Catholic Church got its own national hierarchy, so exited from the propaganda fide. And at that point, the Vatican granted the United States a hierarchy under canon law. Now, what happened then was an American-born hierarchy replaced the papal representatives, and together with the Vatican city-state that was recognized in the Lateran Accords, these steps helped prepare the Church for both its current international role and the recovery of many of its former roles in civil society, by eliminating the suspicion of foreign influence, by essentially allowing there to be a new native full-fledged franchise of the religion. So how does this compare to Islam in Europe? Well, the arrival of Muslims in Europe also coincided with violent political conflict in the countries of origin, which spilled over into the diaspora. It was not the anarchist threat of the liberalizing, late 19th century. Instead, it was the Islamist threat of the late 20th, early 21st century. And much like in the United States case, the religious authorities in the countries of origin delayed accepting that these diasporas were in fact permanent. And so they treated them as a missionary branch without local autonomy in the same way. And when terrorist attacks struck European capitals, authorities discovered that those who were committing the violence had generally received also no religious education and no formal training, and did not have access to prayer spaces or imams or any sort of trained scholars in religion. So to counter this extremism, much like in the United States, Europeans worked with the sending states to import prayer leaders at first and to build more mosques. They helped create new councils, try to begin that process of domestication, of treating Europe not as a missionary country for Islam, but as a home of Islam. So not Dar al-Harb or, the abode of war, but rather Dar al-Islam, so a place where Islam is at home. But this is where the differences start to emerge with US Catholicism, because the integration of Islam in European countries has been, of course, marked by great ambivalence. European governments tend to embrace what they call the Europeanist schools of Islam, but they also reject any enduring foreign influences within the diaspora communities. They are, for example, deeply uncomfortable with the role played by homeland religious institutions like the Turkish Diyanet or the Moroccan Habus in European religious life. So ironically, European governments continue to rely on imams who are trained elsewhere, and there is an ongoing shortage of religious personnel. So this phase of the third defeat, I argue, is especially important for two reasons. And the first is that you have the rapid growth of national Islamic authorities back in the Muslim majority states. And they have developed increasingly specialized roles in religious service provision and in the enforcement of their monopoly. They employ tens of thousands at home. They spend 1%, up to 1% of the national budget on religious affairs. And they increasingly tailor their offerings to the diaspora population in Europe. Now, unlike the previous growth of Islamic services, this is not a purely repressive increase in spending. There are now many more trained religious professionals, imams, teachers, ulama. This has been somewhat unequal across the regions of origin for the European Muslims. So you can see that Turkey and Morocco, for example, are far ahead of Tunisia and Algeria. And you can see the correlation between greater spending and greater, more effective combating of violent extremism, simply because they're filling a space that is otherwise a vacuum. So lower spending tends to lead to less effective combating of violent extremism. So this is a detailed view of state-sponsored mosques and imams in 21st century Turkey. This is interesting, I think, first of all, because it shows you the number of imams and mosques per capita, right? And it also shows that there is, despite the kind of impression that one gets that, mosque building has become ubiquitous under the AKP regime, that in fact, for the most part, the AKP was keeping up with population growth and not actually expanding as much as we thought in relative terms. Now, the 21st century Islam policies have started to change the place of Islam within Muslim majority democracies and democratizing countries, leading to the first instances of what you might call soft restoration. And this follows the 20th century phase of interior ministry control over Islam, which is combined with a severe underfinancing of prayer spaces and religious education. So the soft restoration that I'm describing is really a transfer of the religious services oversight from the police and the interior ministry into newly empowered religious affairs ministries with actual specialized personnel and training. So there is now a more organic proportion, you could say, of mosques and personnel to believers. You see the depenalization of headscarf wearing, of course, in Turkey. You see the resumption of religious education, which had been unnaturally suppressed in the 1990s under the last secular governments, which had devalued religious studies by making it virtually impossible for anyone who went to a parochial high school to continue on to university in anything but religious studies. And of course, that is a main distinction with what the AKP government did by restoring Quranic studies and restoring the Imam Hatip schools to a level that also seems high when contrasted with the 1990s, but if you compare it to even a country like France, which has significant numbers of confessional schools for Catholics and Jews, and a couple now for Muslims, that the rates of confessional schooling actually aren't very different, even between France and Turkey, even after the incredible growth. So we can also see this happening in Morocco and Algeria. So this is, I believe, a time when governments are making up for what had been a very suppression-oriented policy of the previous generation, the kind of the Ben Ali generation in Tunisia, the Bourguiba generation in before that, but the Hassan II generation in Morocco, the Boumediene generation in Algeria. And there's an underappreciated aspect of this, which is that as religious affairs spending has risen, there has been greater autonomy within the religious affairs ministries to essentially run their own affairs without the interference of the interior ministries. Now, because of their large diasporas, these policies have also influenced the practice of Islam in Europe. And as I mentioned, European governments show extreme ambivalence towards this outreach because they fear that it inhibits integration. So it's worth discussing whether that is a reasonable or misplaced fear. But meanwhile, sending countries have taken steps to remove their European diasporas from missionary status, right? And this is something that takes place very slowly, obviously, but much like the Catholic Church started to treat the United States as its own Catholic entity, you have increasingly European diasporas who are allowed to treat Europe as a permanent home with a sort of the corresponding dispensations that might come with living outside of a Muslim majority country, and the creation of new Islamic councils of ulama specifically focused on the needs of European Muslims. So instead of simply applying the religious rulings from the homeland and say this goes for all Moroccans everywhere, for example, you have the beginnings of a council of European ulama for Moroccans in Europe, right? And that's what I would consider to be analogous to the United States hierarchy, for example, for the Catholic Church. Now, European concerns about foreign influence over their domestic Muslim communities provides a window onto what you might call the custody battle that is ongoing over international Islam. I think there's not, polls have shown there's no public appetite for ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but their charismatic leaders have drawn attention to the caliph's empty seat. For many Muslims, the Saudi Hashemite duopoly over Islam's holy cities is tainted by their military dependence on non-Muslim powers. And they're tainted, of course, also by their existential association with British occupation and imperial rule. The Muslim Brotherhood has, of course, entered a period of suppression. But as you know, Hamas is an offshoot, is a violent offshoot of that same movement. So it's not dead yet. So what we have left are transnational contenders from the realm of what I call nation-state Islam. Morocco, for example, has been extremely active within its sphere of Maliki, within the Maliki school, the legal school, one of the 4 legal schools of Sunni Islam, where the King of Morocco is considered to be the commander of the faithful for all Maliki Muslims, wherever they are found in Africa or Europe. So there is a kind of caliphal role, if you like, that the Moroccan king embodies. But it's actually Turkey that has done the most, perhaps unsurprisingly, to embody the old caliphate by building mosques and training clerics worldwide, and essentially leaning into this role of being the protector of Muslims worldwide, and the protector of Muslim of Islam's holy cities. So this is just one example of the data I collected about what Turkey has done for Jerusalem in the last 20 years. It's very interesting to see how Turkey has worked with Israel to essentially help establish itself as a protector, as a kind of guardian over the Al-Aqsa complex, over, as a defender of the Palestinians. But they've also been beautifying Jerusalem. And so, these authorities are looking to play a prominent leadership role internationally that goes well beyond their diaspora population. Right? So that's the point about the Moroccan king's activity over borders, and the point about the many Turkish agencies that are active across borders. This has led to a very great popularity of the Turkish president abroad. When he is reelected, there are celebrations around the Muslim world. But the current practices suggest the potential for a slightly less fragmented ummah, right, for the future. Now, the role of Turkey in its near abroad has greater poignancy, given the success of the Taliban, who have nearly 500 million Muslims in their immediate vicinity, including many whose religious life Turkey aims to shape. So the recent attack on Israeli civilians can also be read in terms of this broad competition for political religious authority in the vacuum of what will, in March, be 100 years since the abolition of the caliphate. And I spend a lot of time in the book discussing how the caliphate was terminated essentially through European occupation of India and North Africa and what were known as the East Indies, Indonesia and Java, where Islam had actually expanded quite significantly institutionally and spread ideologically as an alternative to European imperial hegemony. But of course, once the Turkish Republic abolished the caliphate, that was the end of that. Now, demography may help determine the fate of which movements prevail. So even though the European empires returned the caliphate to the Arabs, ethnically speaking, global Islam is more than 3/4 non-Arab. So what kind of conclusions can we draw? Well, one is that religion and state benefit mutually from a strategy of international recognition and soft restoration in civil society. That theological training can serve both the homeland while allowing for the development of local autonomy within the diaspora. And finally, there's of course no caliph to sign a peace treaty like the Pope could with the Lateran Accords, but a symbolic resolution with some of the new leadership figures and structures is possible, because without that, there's little chance for the pluralist experience of religious minorities in the West to reach the Muslim world. And this is the last slide. Because together with the recognition of Vatican City, it was this dynamic of feedback from the periphery, from the diaspora, back onto the religious core that has allowed for the peaceful cohabitation of democratic citizenship with religious faith. The Second Vatican Council, of course, coincided with the Americanization of the episcopate and the Cardinal College to a certain extent, and the spread of a kind of minoritarian understanding of what kind of religious rights are essential, including for others. So ultimately, I believe these steps helped to integrate what was a culturally alienated community back into the national community, not only in the United States, but also across Europe for both minority and majority Catholic settings. And it allowed for the soft restoration of the traditional civil society roles that the church can play, not only in granting civil effects to life cycle events, but also in the health and education sectors more broadly. And without it, the democratic right to free religious exercise may continue to be seen as a hindrance to political integration, whereas the argument of the book is that it needs help finding its rightful place within the new order. So that is the conclusion of my slideshow.
Yeah, that's a fascinating talk. I have some thoughts, questions myself, but let me, should I manage? We're a small group, so we
No,
can.
whatever, if we can just jump in, yeah.
All right, so why don't we just start? Anybody want to jump in? Do we have any, how are we doing online? Do we have people, potential questions online? Or we can get some online questions too. So who wants to begin? Okay, thank you. And I see two hands up. Could you tell me your name again? I know.
Sally, Tari.
Tari and
Judith.
all right, Tari and Judith. Okay, go.
Yeah, hi, thank you for your talk. I had like two questions about like use of terminology. I was just wondering, like, first of all, like in so many kind of like theorizations of what a modern state is, it so often seems to be modeled on like Western hegemony, like ideas around that. So I was just wondering, so like what makes a state modern? And also, like, you know, we're like a trio of medievalists here. And so I myself, like, I think a lot about, like, you know, ideas of nation, like before like the 16th century as well. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And then I was also interested in hearing why like the word defeats, or the concept of defeats, like seemed like a useful kind of concept to tie these things together. Like, can we also describe these moments in history as you know, as like shifts, or like, you know, as like why was defeat useful here? So those are my two questions.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So the modernization of the nation state is, you know, sort of the political science use of that term refers to the rationalization, the centralization, the advent of modern ministries of government, a bureaucratic core, and the homogenization of the national territory, because that's like one of the key. So there's a kind of I guess like a Eugen Weber kind of view of this, where the nation state has a kind of steamroller effect on the linguistic, cultural, and religious lives of its subjects. And so that's special in the late 19th century, because the state's capacity to do this is enhanced for various reasons. So that's the modern aspect, is that the state can reach into the citizenry in a new way. And
I think also, like, the reason why I'm also asking this in like, you know, in lots of Islamophobic rhetoric, like, so often like modernity is like opposed to Islam. So, you know, so hence, like, you know, the kind of interest in and like, you know, what that then means if
well, the Muslim, you know, so these countries, you know, were colonized by European states, so their states resemble the modern European states. Not that they have to or ought to or should, but they just do. You know, it's their heritage, it's their legacy, it's institutionally. And so until we get beyond this nation state order, we're kind of like, so the modernizing Muslim states are included. So Morocco, for example, just over the last 10, 20 years has started to get a handle on its territory. Just the simple act of like inventorying your land. How many buildings are there? How many mosques are there? How many people are there? You know, these are the tools of you know, what was a kind of Western model, post-Westphalian state, but which you know, we're still living in that European world, you know, in terms of the international order. Right. So I include the Muslims, so, you know, I'm not sort of contrasting it with Islam or anything like that. It's really just about state logic. And why defeat? So that's a really good question. And so that's something that I never know how to present this book, because it's a lot going on in it. And But so what got me thinking about defeat was actually reading, wait for it, Samuel Huntington, but not his civilizational treatises, but his work on civil-military relations. And he has this interesting theory that in the early 1800s, that like the officer corps of the Western European nations professionalized. And they professionalized in such a way that allowed the military establishment to come firmly under the control of the national government. And as you know, this is like one of the great tensions of any state is, you know, how do you keep the army from taking over all the time? And one of the ways it turns out is by creating a professional officer corps. And how did this happen? How did this professionalization take place and help the military find its place in this modern state order? Well, by getting routed by Napoleon's armies. And so those countries which were routed by Napoleon's armies had a kind of, you know, internal process with how could this happen? We have to emerge somehow differently, somehow better. But what emerges is actually a more orderly civil-military relationship. And so the idea here is that the core of religious professionals in a country is not so different than, you know, the militias of yore, essentially, when it comes to the state's perspective, because they may or may not be working against the state's interests. And so there develops this kind of, you know, imposing need to organize it. And so the idea is that with each religious defeat of religious authorities, that there is a kind of counter movement that changes the nature of the religious authorities' relationship with the state, much in the way that the military's relationship changed. And that's the purpose of, you know, some of these little diagrams, is that you get closer to religious authorities essentially accepting to operate under the state's rule of law after each defeat. But it comes also in exchange for an increased quality or an increased quantity of resources, and ultimately, you know, the kind of restoration of autonomy. So if you look at where like the military landed, right? The military landed obviously under civilian leadership, right? We have the defense minister wears a tie and not, you know, and this is similar to, you know, the way that religious organizations are regulated in democracies, where you have the ultimate arbiter, which will be a tax authority or some kind of interior ministry official who is deciding essentially which religious figures may operate or may not, or be recognized as such. But that in exchange for that extreme oversight, there's a great degree of internal autonomy. So the military has its own martial courts, right? The military doesn't even have to participate in the national justice system. The military has its own affirmative action rules. The military doesn't even have to operate by the lessons of the Supreme Court, the finding of the Supreme Court. And so the idea is that there's a kind of trade-off between subordination in exchange for autonomy and self-rule. And that's the process.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the idea. I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah.
I agree. Judy?
Yes, I had two questions. Maybe I missed this, but I'm really curious about your slide backgrounds. Why the train? And the other point was how you're defining terrorism and anarchism.
So the train, you know about the Hejaz Railway? Hejaz Railway was one of the last great Ottoman public works, where Abdülhamid II hired a bunch of German engineers and raised millions from Muslims around the world, not least in India. And the idea was to link by rail Damascus, ultimately with Mecca and Medina. So Damascus, of course, being an Ottoman hub. And to cut down the travel time of performing the Hajj, right, which had been pretty dicey, to make it your way across the desert, depending where you're coming from. So the Hejaz Railway was this last great Ottoman sort of pan-Islamic project that almost made it. Got there. They built the tracks. They never made it quite all the way. And so this train car is actually was built in Scotland, and it was it was Laurence of Arabia who had actually co-sponsored with a Sharifian prince the one sort of trains to kind of go on these tracks. And so the idea is that the great ambitious religious projects that are essentially left now to rust in the desert. And so that's the defeat aspect that I wanted to highlight. And then about anarchism and terrorism.
Where you're defining this.
So anarchism, well, there were anarchists who had anarchist societies and anarchist journals, and so I take them at their word. And there are different kinds of anarchists. Some who believe in individual, even collective efforts, but in the early 1900s, the United States was the biggest safe haven for anarchists worldwide. There were a lot of political prisoners who had escaped European jails and come to New Jersey, and to Cincinnati and to Chicago, to all the big industrial hubs, and they were finding recruits, right? I mean, they were finding that they had all of the oxygen that they needed to wage a campaign of assassinating as many heads of state and government as they could. And they could do this from the safe haven of the United States because the American authorities were not paying attention at all. And so the analogy there is the absolute free hand that Islamists had in Western Europe, similarly, without the authorities really understanding what was going on, because it was from the United States that you had the most widely circulated Italian anarchist journals. You had, these anarchists who would come and on tour throughout the United States and would essentially hold these massive meetings, calling for the death of kings and potentates and basically any head of state. And then they did it. They actually did it, and they did it with American arms. So this was also the same time that the revolver, was just being manufactured for mass market. So these assassinations were taking place with multiple shot guns for the first time. So you didn't have to be that good a shot anymore because you had more than one chance. So that increased lethality. And then of course, dynamite was invented around this time by Alfred Nobel. And dynamite was used by construction workers. And construction workers were also those who were sort of the most suspected, because these were the working guys from Italy, Poland, from all the Catholic countries where you had the most successful anarchist movements. And so the Europeans crushed the anarchist movements, which moved here. And then after McKinley was assassinated, the United States crushed the anarchist movement. And so you could say that, North Africa and Turkey crushed the Islamist movements in the 1970s and 1980s, and then they flourished in the 1990s and 2000s in Europe until they in turn got crushed. And so the analogy is terrorism is just like attacking non-military targets, basically. That's
As a non-state entity, and therefore not having any kind of legitimate take towards violence.
as a non-state entity, yeah, no, well, terror, as you know, I mean, that comes from it's a state practice, terror. That's a French thing from the 1790s.
I know, I'm asking precisely because it's such a disputed term. It's widely used, and it's essentially whoever the state decides to call a terrorist right now, or whoever is able to say, hey, that kind of violence is not legitimate.
Yeah, I don't know if I have the.
I know that's not the main part of your talk at all.
No,
It's just that I work on terrorism, so I was curious.
Yeah.
And specifically how that term comes about.
Well, right, you know, I mean, so yeah, the term comes from the Committee on Public Safety, and you know, the intent to eliminate dissent in revolutionary France. But here, you know, all the terrorist incidents that I include are assassinations and bombs in public places. So there were bombs in theaters that were left by it's in Barcelona, in the French Parliament. And so it's not just, you know, like even if a state did that, it wouldn't be, you know, it'd be legitimate, but it depends on your state.
Yeah. Also depends on how easily they can later on make it look like it wasn't the state. I'm talking about Italy in 1969, December 12th. There were a series of bombs, one of which went off, and afterwards, for a long time, the state blamed the left. To the point that actually in 2000, when a survey was made of Milanese high school students, 43% still blame those bombs on the left. So, yeah, terrorism is a tricky
Right,
term.
but that might just be a thermometer of political polarization that would apply to other, you know, other questions.
No, I just wanted to
yeah.
point that out. Yeah, terrorism is a tricky term.
No, it's a great point. And yeah, it's an interesting point because these things can be disguised, absolutely.
Yeah, I just have a small question. Something I'm curious about that you mentioned in like the second form of defeat and the rise of the nation state with the like Turkey's divestment from like religious institutions. I'm just curious about the motivation there. You mentioned that. I just kind of was wondering if you could expand a little.
So yeah, so the Third Republic France invited a bunch of young Turkish military to come study in Paris. And this was like late 1890s, early 1900s. And these Turkish military figures were heavily infused with what was just sort of a budding concept of laïcité. And as you know, the idea of laïcité was not just separation or respect for religion, but it was also the notion that religious institutions and the religious establishment generally held back modernization, economic modernization, political modernization. And so in order to advance as a nation state in a competitive way, part of what you had to do is defeat that old religious establishment, which is conservative and interfering with your state project. And so in France, it was obviously the episcopate, the cardinalate. It was all of these, you know, these church figures who had been anti-republican since 1790. You know, so there was real grounds there. And in Turkey, of course, the religious figures had become so closely associated with the old regime. Because that was their bread and butter, that they were defending internationally. And so the notion was that if you wanted to modernize the state, and especially to make Turkey a member of the European states, that you had to similarly evict the religious establishment from public institutions and office holding. And they just went a little bit too far, you could say, because they got to a point where by the 1940s, 1950s, people couldn't bury their parents with religious rites and things like that, because there was just no one around to do that. And so in the starting in the early 1950s, you have a growth again, and then it goes back and forth, as you know. But it's the 21st century when there's a kind of restoration, soft restoration of but yeah, so that's the idea.
Thank you. I was going to say something, more of a comment than a question, but it's things that made me think about. I mean, when you think of laïcité, you have the French national state against the French nation state against the French Catholic establishment. So you have, the sort of French version of Catholicism, basically. And in Italy, it's a peculiar situation in the sense that the Pope in Rome didn't accept the unification of Italy in the 1860s. And the Pope was always considered to be a prisoner of the Vatican. The Pope lost land and territory when, they were real rulers in a way, as opposed to in France, they didn't own any parts of France. I mean, they must have had monasteries and things, but they didn't have the kind of church. I'm assuming this because I don't know enough church history, but they always talk about the papal territories that were lost, which was one of the reasons the Pope retreated to the Vatican and stayed there until the Concordat in 1929. So, but there are two things going on, it seems to me, that are kind of interesting. You have the Roman Catholic Church specific relationship with the nation state of Italy, which was resolved through that 1929 Concordat, the Lateran Treaty, with Mussolini, who was hoping that he could get something out of the church as he was advancing regime. And then you have something else going on, and that is the church is a kind of global actor, because that church in Rome was also, as I understand it, the church in Europe too. It wasn't just the Italian church, it was Catholicism, right? I mean, those were the people that went to America, but they didn't go just as Italian Catholics, they went as Catholics. You see what I'm trying to, I'm thinking out loud. So and you can respond to it in any way you want, because it's not really that kind of a question. It's a thought process. And one of the things that people don't one of the interesting things about the church until 1929 in Italy was that they were sort of running in two parallel. I mean, the church didn't recognize the Italian state. The state wanted the church out of the way, like the French had sort of taken care of that, But I don't know if you know this, but in Italy, if you were getting married, you had to get married, if you were Catholic, you had to get married by the priest, but then you had to go get married by the Italian state too, or else you wouldn't be married. So there were like two parallel tracks that sort of were eliminated after 1929. But how did that really, I guess if there is a question here, I'm thinking, so that took care of the church in Italy, more or less. But how did that take care of the church globally? Like when the church was stuck in the Vatican, so to speak, I mean, those people that were coming to the United States, those anarchists, were from the Italy where the church was not part, were from the Catholic Church that was not part of Italy. So how did that all disentangle, I guess? I mean, you may not have thought of it. I haven't thought of it either, too, exactly as a question until now. But I mean, I know enough of the history. I just haven't put it together until your talk.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing the book is trying to do is say that we think of only France as having imposed these restrictions on the clergy. And then we think of Italy's relationship as being very special And I try to say that, you know, actually what was happening in Italy, was happening in France, was happening in Germany, like all of these processes are comparable because, you know, on the right-hand side there, you have different things that happen in each of these Catholic contexts. Seizing church property, taking over bishop nominations, secularizing education, creating an office for religious affairs, denaturalizing, expelling, or imprisoning clergy. So you have this oppression of the Jesuits. Like this is across the board. This is like the challenge that nation states face with regard to international Catholicism. So one response would be like, it's not that, you know, these cases are not as distinct as we
Think they are,
suspect.
no,
Yeah.
But I guess, like, so in France, could you get married in the Catholic Church and have it recognized by the French state?
No, and
Then they had to get married twice too.
well, so right. So this is what soft restoration is. Soft restoration is allowing the clergy to have civil effects again.
Oh.
And so you know, in the Muslim countries, for example, they decided to kind of strike a compromise because no one was registering with the city hall. And so they said to the imams, like, here's a book, just like keep the book and write down whom you're marrying, and then we'll register it for you. And so there was a little bit of that, but no, but you could only get married at the city hall in France.
Okay.
And there are, you know, there's still no civil effects of the clergy in that realm.
Even now?
So no, you have to get married at the city hall.
And then you can't.
You could do whatever you want before or after, but you have to get married.
I did have a Cornell student who married a Muslim, very well integrated German, and she had 3 weddings, well, 2 in Germany and 1 in the United States. So, and that was recent, like in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, no,
it's interesting because that gets into personal life too, in a way that, you know, you don't sort of think about. It's, you know, it's quite fascinating when you start thinking about, when you really dig into the stories and the trajectories and sort of things. It's really fascinating.
I see a question behind you there. If I can ask it, yes. I'm really interested. I went to a Jesuit high school. And I can't help but notice that coming from Boston College, there are questions that I kind of have about the Jesuits' role in Europe. I'm much more familiar with kind of Latin America at certain points. Many states became hostile towards the Jesuits. For I assume different reasons, but was it because the Jesuits in some sense fulfilled a more bureaucratic apparatus and more integrated apparatus than the average church? Or is that just specifically because the Jesuits posed a separate type of threat than say just the normal clergy, I guess, versus their counterparts?
So so the Jesuits, here you have you know, Ignatius receiving his commission from the Pope to create the Society of Jesus, the Compagnia di Gesù. So, you know, the orders of, you know, the monastic and priestly orders generally were organized around a saint, right? You had Benedictines, you had Franciscans, Sulpicians. The Jesuits were not, right? The Jesuits received a special charter directly from the Pope, and their patron saint, as it were, is like Jesus. And whereas other orders would essentially be reporting to through the hierarchy of local bishops, archbishops, cardinals, and therefore local politics, because that's how those people got appointed. Jesuits had a stovepipe relationship to Rome and with the propaganda fide. So they were seen as being particularly hard to govern for that reason. And there were, various kings who essentially said to the Pope, like, we don't want this, and the compromise was to essentially suppress them. And of course, the church itself suppressed the Jesuits from the 1770s to the 1810s, when Georgetown was created as the first Catholic university in the United States by Jesuit John Carroll. But actually there was no Jesuit order back then, because that was during the suppression. But yeah, so I would say they were seen as threatening, also because the Pope essentially gave them this mission of defending the remnants of the church after the Reformation. And of course, the New World was seen as one major way to replenish the ranks that had been lost to the Reformation. And so the Jesuits came very early to Maryland, and they, along with many other orders, were very active here for centuries before the church got here, because the church was treating it as a missionary country, and therefore not putting all of its educational institutions and governing institutions. But the Jesuits created all of these colleges. I mean, almost all of them. And the purpose of those colleges was to train young priests who could then go back and essentially engage in pulpit to pulpit combat to keep various Protestant movements from spreading, because they were spreading everywhere, including in Italy and France. And then the other idea was to kind of try to preserve those Catholics that still existed as a minority elsewhere. And so for that reason, they were seen as problematic, because they were not part of the majority sect.
We got any other questions?
Yeah, I'll go there.
I mean, this is more like, because I know that, so your work like really begins like in the 16th century, right? Most like what you've done with the book that I haven't read. So, but I'm just kind of curious, because again, yeah, medievalists, like I'm interested in you do mention here, like, in this figure, like the disunity from 1377 to 1405. So referring to like the papal schism. So and you were also just mentioning like, different sects, like of course, like also in this like, like period of empire, like there have always been like competing sects and like different ways in which like these religious like disputes would break down. So how, like, is that, and like both in Islam as well as in like Catholicism, or like, in Christianity. So to what extent can we like, apply like that kind of concept of defeat, to the extent that you've like engaged with this at all, like in pre the 16 like pre-modern like era. And then also the second kind of question as well, because we like your work also touches here on the effects of colonialism, imperialism, and yeah, obviously the rise of the nation state. So I was also just thinking about like Al-Andalus in in Iberia, and the long reign of different like Islamic states in what is now Spain and Portugal, and with Christian and Jewish like minoritized groups that had more agency overall than the other way around in other European states. And then especially like, and that relates back to like the colonialism and imperialism of it all, with like Spain and Portugal being like like precipitating this as like in Europeans, like compared to like the other European states, like they were the fastest in engaging in like in all of these in this colonialism, like after the so-called Reconquest. So, you know, so in my work, like I see like those long connections, like across like, you know, the pre-modern and modern like divide, and which kind of muddy that divide. So it's again, like, you know, I don't know how much you've like, you know, like thought about like Al-Andalus or, you know, that specific like kind of Iberian context. But that you know, like seems very much in my mind connected to this as well. So, you know, was just kind of wondering about like, you know, any thoughts about, you know, those two things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Christendom obviously experiences a great fracture, you know, 500 years before the Reformation. And I, you know, I went through various libraries and archives in Rome trying to tally institutional responses at different times, and you know, there were these proto-Reformation movements in between 1100 and 1500, some of which got, you know, kind of far, but most of which were squelched pretty effectively. So, you know, this is like, what is it? The drunken sailor looking for his keys under the lamplight, you know? So I'm finding my material in the repository of where they started to keep records of things, right? And so, of course, I'm finding the records that they keep and not the ones that they didn't, or the ones that didn't exist yet. And so there's a kind of coincidence of like, you know, I'm actually just like a political scientist. I'm not even a, you know, archivist or historian, or so there's a kind of practicality to it, like where can I start to get some data? And I mean data like really rudimentarily, like just counting dioceses and things like that. And that, you know, it's really just around the Reformation when a lot of things get a lot more serious, and that's largely because of this. And things that had been very decentralized and very informal suddenly become a matter of study and regulation and university degrees and that sort of thing. So to be a priest or a bishop or a cardinal before the Council of Trent, you just kind of had to know the right people. You know, I think it's in the city of Worms in Germany in like 1430. Like, I think that 30% of the city of Worms were men of the cloth, like somehow, like everyone was a clergyman. But really, it was just like a social status. So what happens with the Council of Trent, as you know, is the creation of the Tridentine Seminary. So the notion that Catholics need a diocese and each diocese needs a seminary. At that point, you start to have more formal training. And well, that's the catechism, but you know, the catechism is just one of a series of novel ways of formalizing Catholic ritual life. And that only starts then. You can't find it any earlier. I mean, I don't think it happened any earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I will like, you know, I will definitely like say like in university, like education, like it's like not that this is like an expertise of mine, but it's set up very differently. You know, you have the trivium as well, also still, and like all of these different things that are in a way more kind of intertwined. As like, you know, like I think especially like in the modern sense of the university, like here, like it's very much, oh, you have like, you know, this is your discipline, and then when you do something interdisciplinary, that's always like, ooh. But I think that was not really like preoccupation like of like the medieval university in that sense.
Yeah, they emphasize the 7 liberal arts. And I suppose some people might have a specialization, but really to have a classical formal education, you delved into all of those areas.
Yeah.
Right, and it was rotten, right? Because it was corrupt And it was offering very low quality services on average, because you didn't even have necessarily literate leaders, right? I mean, so there's a reason why, you know, the door that Luther and company were pushing on collapsed upon pushing on them, right? But this is, you know, this is my attempt to kind of answer that question, is that, you know, you just sort of, what formal religious training institutions exist? You know, were there religious seminaries? Were there religious universities? And so there weren't, and then there were. You know, and so that, you know, it's these are all like little pieces of a big mosaic that I'm trying to put together. And, you know, some aspects of the argument are going to be weaker than others, but you should read it, you know, read it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that you are taking like a longer history, like perspective. That's always, it's good to see. Sorry, that sounds weird.
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean.
I mean, it is historic. I know you're a political scientist. I know you are a political scientist, but it is historical.
That's what the university degree says.
Yes, yes. No, yeah. So you're just, you have some of that, you know, classical liberal. Yeah.
And also just to be clear, like I wasn't like asking my question to be like, oh, you should have done this, but also just like, you know, again, like I like in my work, like I'm trying to like go from like a medieval into early modern. So so it's always interesting for me to kind of consider like to what extent can we do that, you know, and what are like the different like ramifications of doing that in these different periods and in these different places as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a challenge. I mean, it's fun, but it's a challenge.
Yeah.
Other questions? Well, and we have to thank you for
Well, thank
this.
you. Thank you.
It's wonderful. And I'm impressed that my involvers are. And looked at all those things, which must have been the original papers that you had to turn over. Handwriting.
Yeah, I found letters from Ignatius to, you know, authorities recruiting students
what
for
did
his
he
Germanic
write?
college.
You wrote in Italian?
No, they wrote
Latin.
in Latin, yeah.
So you read Latin too? Enough.
That time, Latin and Italian were getting closer.
Closer, yeah. Of course, Latin is the thing that you have to read. Jesuits still teach today,
Greek.
Latin and Greek.
Yes.
Yes.
But yeah, no, thank you.
Well, thank